It was one of those chilly evenings in New York City when the streets were crowded, but everyone seemed too busy to notice each other. Cars honked impatiently, and people rushed past with their collars up, eager to escape the biting wind. Amongst them was Ethan Grant, a self-made millionaire whose life seemed nothing short of perfect. Dressed in a tailored suit and a wristwatch that cost more than most people's monthly rent, Ethan was used to getting what he wanted without delay. But that evening, something unusual caught his eye. As his driver eased the sleek black Mercedes to a stop at a red light, Ethan spotted a boy no older than 10, sitting on the curb, shoulders shaking with sobs. The boy's clothes were worn, his sneakers scuffed, and too large for his feet. He was alone, face buried in his hands, with no adult in sight. For a moment, Ethan considered looking away. He wasn't the type to get involved, but something about the boy's despair struck a chord, a memory Ethan had long buried. Before he could think twice, he instructed his driver to pull over. Stepping out of the warm car and into the biting cold, Ethan hesitated. People rarely stopped for anyone on these streets, much less someone like him. Yet, driven by a mix of curiosity and something he couldn't quite place, he approached the boy cautiously. The boy flinched at the sound of approaching footsteps, but didn't lift his head until Ethan spoke softly, asking if he was okay. Big, tear-filled eyes peeked up, red-rimmed and filled with a fear that seemed far too heavy for a child his age. "I'm lost," the boy stammered, wiping at his face with the sleeve of his jacket. His voice was small, almost drowned out by the city's noise. "I can't find my sister." The words tumbled out between sobs, and Ethan's resolve hardened. He might not have been used to playing the hero, but he couldn't just leave the kid alone in the cold. He knelt down, making himself smaller, less intimidating, and offered a gentle smile. Ethan learned the boy's name was Alex, and his sister, Mia, was just a few years older. They had been separated at a nearby subway station when the crowd surged. As Alex spoke, shivering despite Ethan's attempts to shield him from the wind, the man couldn't help but notice how thin the boy was, how his fingers were almost blue from the cold. Without a second thought, Ethan shrugged off his own coat and draped it over Alex's small shoulders. But as they talked, a strange feeling began to creep up Ethan's spine, like they were being watched. His eyes scanned the busy sidewalks, the sea of faces, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Dismissing it as paranoia, he guided Alex back to the car, promising to help him find his sister. He didn't expect the boy to flinch again, eyes widening, with something that looked an awful lot like guilt. "It's okay," Ethan reassured him, opening the door and helping him inside. "We'll find her." But Alex's hands trembled, his gaze darting nervously out the window, as if searching for something or someone. They hadn't driven more than a few blocks when Alex suddenly spoke, voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have stopped." The words were so quiet that for a moment, Ethan thought he'd imagined them. But when he looked over, the boy's eyes were fixed firmly on his own, wide and terrified. "Why?" Ethan asked slowly, a chill creeping down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. But Alex only shook his head, biting his lips so hard it turned white. Before Ethan could press further, the car jolted to a sudden stop, nearly sending him forward in his seat. His driver cursed under his breath, muttering about a roadblock. But when Ethan looked out, his breath caught. 3 black SUVs had boxed them in, their windows dark and unreadable. Panic flared in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm, to think. "Stay here," he ordered Alex, pushing open the door despite the boy's desperate grab at his sleeve. Outside, the cold was sharper, biting through his shirt. Ethan barely took 2 steps before the doors of the SUV swung open, and half a dozen men in dark jackets spilled out, faces hidden beneath caps. Something about their movements was precise, practiced, like they'd done this before. Mr. Grant, one of them called, voice smooth and cold. "We've been looking for you." Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. This was no coincidence, but as his mind raced, trying to piece together who would want to trap him in the middle of a crowded city, a small, terrified voice cut through the chaos. "I'm sorry," Alex sobbed, eyes huge and glistening with fresh tears. "They said they'd hurt Mia if I didn't help them." And in that moment, everything clicked. The way Alex had hesitated, the nervous glances over his shoulder, the strange chill that had settled in Ethan's bones. This wasn't just a chance encounter. He had walked straight into a trap. But who were these men? And what did they want with him? As the circle of dark figures closed in, Ethan's mind raced with questions. Questions that might go unanswered if he didn't think fast. Because one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. Ethan's heart pounded as the circle of men tightened. The chill of the evening air, nothing compared to the ice creeping through his veins. The man who had spoken stepped forward, his eyes flat and unfeeling beneath the shadow of his cap. Ethan's mind raced, scrambling for a way out, but every path seemed to lead back to the same question. Who were these people? And what did they want with him? Before he could open his mouth to demand answers, 2 of the men lunged forward, seizing his arms with a grip that left no room for struggle. Ethan twisted, muscles straining, but their hold was ironclad. Panic flashed in Alex's eyes, guilt swimming beneath the tears, and for a heartbeat, Ethan almost called out to him. But what could he say? The boy was just as trapped as he was. They shoved Ethan into one of the black SUVs, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in his ears. The man who seemed to be in charge climbed in beside him, while the others stayed outside, engines revving to life. Through the tinted glass, Ethan caught a glimpse of Alex, his small figure trembling beside the car. But then they were moving, city lights blurring past. "Who are you?" Ethan's voice came out steadier than he felt, but his hands were shaking. "And what do you want?" The man leaned back, a ghost of a smile playing at the edges of his mouth. "It's not who we are that matters," he said smoothly. "It's who you've crossed." The words hit like a punch. Ethan's mind spun, flickering through deals and rivals, but nothing fit. His business was clean, or as clean as a millionaire's could be. But the man's expression suggested otherwise. Eyes glinting with a cold amusement that set Ethan's teeth on edge. "You've made powerful enemies, Mr. Grant," he continued, examining his gloves, as if bored by the whole affair. "Enemies who don't appreciate being outplayed." Ethan's jaw clenched. There had been a few deals that hadn't gone smoothly. Competitors edged out, and partnerships dissolved. But none of it was enough to warrant this. "If they have a problem, they can talk to me themselves," he snapped, hiding behind kids. "That's low, even for them." The man's smile widened, dark and humorless. "It's not about what's low. It's about what works." They drove for what felt like hours, the city giving way to quieter streets, and then to an industrial district. The buildings looming like silent sentinels. The SUV pulled into an abandoned warehouse, tires crunching over gravel. As the doors opened, Ethan was hauled out, boots scraping the ground. He struggled, fury bubbling beneath the fear. But another pair of hands forced him forward into the shadows. The warehouse was dark and cavernous, the air heavy with dust and rust. In the center, a single chair waited beneath a harsh light, its metal frame gleaming. They shoved Ethan into it, ropes biting into his wrists before he could even think to resist. He pulled against them, breath coming fast, but the knots held firm. Footsteps echoed, slow and measured, and Ethan's eyes snapped up. A man emerged from the darkness, tall and lean, his suit crisp and tailored, the kind of suit Ethan recognized, the kind worn by men who made decisions behind closed doors. But it was the eyes that sent a fresh wave of dread through him, cold, calculating, and far too familiar. "Hello, Ethan," the man drawled, hands sliding casually into his pockets. "It's been a while." Recognition slammed into him. Vincent, Hale. They'd crossed paths years ago, when Ethan was still clawing his way up the ladder. A deal had gone south. Ethan had outmaneuvered him, left him empty-handed and furious. But that had been business, nothing personal. Or so he'd thought. "Vincent," Ethan bit out, forcing the fear down. "Didn't think you held grudges." Vincent chuckled, the sound smooth and deadly. "Not usually, but you made things difficult." His eyes flicked to the shadows, and two men dragged Alex forward, small and terrified. "And now you've met my nephew." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Nephew!" The boy's wide eyes darted between them, guilt and fear warring in his gaze. It hadn't been a random encounter at all. He'd been bait, carefully placed, expertly played. "Leave him out of this," Ethan snapped, struggling against the ropes. "He's just a kid." Vincent arched an eyebrow. "A kid who did exactly what he was told," he said mildly. "You should be grateful. We could have used far less pleasant methods." The words twisted. In Ethan's gut, rage and helplessness, tangling until he could barely breathe. "What do you want?" he ground out, voice raw. Vincent's smile sharpened. "Your company, your shares, all of it." He leaned in, eyes glittering. "Sign it over, and maybe I'll consider letting you walk out of here." Ethan's heart pounded, mind racing through options that all led to dead ends. If he signed, everything he'd built would be gone. But refusing wasn't much better, not with Vincent's men surrounding him and Alex's life hanging in the balance. "You're insane," Ethan bit out. "Careful," Vincent warned, voice soft but deadly. "You're not in a position to negotiate." The door creaked open, and another man strode in, phone in hand. He murmured something to Vincent, too quiet for Ethan to catch. But the expression that flickered across Vincent's face was anything but pleased. "Problem." Ethan couldn't help the jab, desperate to buy time. Vincent's eyes narrowed. "Change of plans," he said coldly. He turned to his men, voice sharp. "Move him!" They yanked Ethan to his feet, ropes biting into his wrists. As they dragged him through the shadows, Alex's eyes locked onto his, wide and terrified, and Ethan could only hold his gaze for a second before he was pulled away. His mind spun with escape plans and dead ends, but one thought pulsed louder than the rest. He couldn't let Vincent win. He couldn't let the empire he'd built be torn down by a grudge and a handful of threats. The warehouse doors loomed ahead, darkness spilling through, and Ethan gritted his teeth, heart pounding, with a mixture of fear and determination. Whatever it took, he would get out of this, and he would make Vincent pay. Ethan's shoulders ached from the ropes cutting into his wrists as they dragged him through the dark corridors of the warehouse. His mind spun with escape plans, each one crumbling under the weight of reality. The chill bit at his skin, but the rage boiling inside kept him moving. Each step a promise that this wasn't over. Ahead, Vincent's men exchanged low whispers. Guns glinting in the sparse light, they shoved him into a smaller room, slamming the door shut. The walls were concrete, windowless, and the only light came from a single bulb swaying overhead. Ethan struggled against the ropes, teeth clenched, but it was no use. His breath came fast, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Moments stretched into minutes, silence thick and suffocating. Then the door creaked open, and Alex stumbled in, pushed roughly by one of Vincent's men. The boy's eyes were rimmed with red, cheeks blotchy from crying. He hesitated in the doorway, guilt etched deep into every line of his face. "I didn't want to," Alex whispered, voice small and cracking. "They said they'd hurt Mia if I didn't help." Ethan's jaw tightened, the pieces falling into place. Vincent hadn't just used the boy. He'd threatened his family, left him no choice. The anger twisted into something colder, sharper. "It's not your fault," Ethan said, forcing his voice steady. "They used you, but we're getting out of here." Alex's eyes widened with a flicker of hope, but it died just as quickly when Vincent strode in, flanked by guards. The man's expression was all ice and sharp edges, satisfaction curling his mouth as he approached. "Touching," Vincent drawled, gesturing to his men. One of them stepped forward, a pen and a sheaf of papers in hand. "But unless you want this to get a lot worse, I suggest you sign." Ethan's gaze dropped to the documents. Control of his company, his shares, everything he'd built from the ground up. His jaw clenched. The thought of handing it all over to the man who had spent years lurking in the shadows, plotting revenge. But his eyes flickered to Alex, small and trembling, and the fight seeped out of his muscles. Vincent smiled, seeing the shift. "Smart choice," he said smoothly, shoving the papers in front of him. "Sign and you and the kid walk out of it. Here, refuse and—" His eyes glinted, leaving the rest unsaid. The pen felt heavy in Ethan's hands. His fingers trembled, but he forced them still, heart pounding. He bent over the papers, eyes scanning the fine print, and that's when he saw it, an address, tucked in a line of text, one that wasn't part of his company's assets. An old building, one Ethan had bought years ago and forgotten about. The kind of place Vincent would hide someone he didn't want found. Hope flickered, faint but fierce. Mia, she had to be there. Ethan's hand stilled, mind racing. He glanced at Alex, then back at Vincent, schooling his expression into something defeated. Slowly, deliberately, he signed, letting the pen drag just enough to buy a few precious seconds. Vincent's eyes gleamed with triumph as he snatched the papers, turning to bark orders at his men. But Ethan wasn't watching him. His eyes were locked on Alex, voice low and urgent. "Listen to me," he breathed. "I know where she is, but you have to trust me." The boy's eyes widened, confusion flickering with hope. But before he could speak, the guards were pulling Ethan to his feet, ropes biting into his wrists as they marched him forward. Vincent's voice was smooth with satisfaction, already planning his next move. But Ethan barely heard him, mind fixed on the address, on the chance that hadn't existed a moment ago. They herded him toward one of the SUVs, and that's when Ethan moved. He twisted sharply, slamming his shoulder into the guard's chest. The man stumbled, grip slipping just enough. Ethan lunged, boots scuffing the concrete, and drove his elbow into another's jaw. The man crumpled with a grunt, gun clattering. To the floor, chaos exploded. Shouts rang out, boots thundering on concrete. Ethan's fingers fumbled with the ropes, desperate, lungs heaving as he ducked another blow. Then, small hands were at his wrists, tugging at the knots. Alex, eyes huge, and terrified but steady. The ropes fell away, and Ethan didn't waste a second, grabbing the fallen gun and shoving Alex behind him. They sprinted through the maze of corridors, bullets biting into walls, footsteps pounding behind them. Ethan's lungs burned, heart a wild drum beat in his ears. But he didn't dare slow down, not until they burst through a side door into the night air, stars glinting above like shards of glass. Ethan shoved Alex into the driver's seat of a parked car, one of Vincent's, hot-wiring it with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, tires screaming as they tore down the deserted streets. "Where are we going?" Alex choked, voice high with panic. "To get your sister," Ethan bit out, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The drive was a blur, streetlights streaking past, the address burning in Ethan's mind. When they screeched to a stop outside the rundown building, Alex was out of the car before it even stopped rolling, legs pumping toward the entrance. Ethan was right behind him, gun raised, every shadow a threat. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. They crept through dark hallways, floorboards groaning beneath their feet, until a faint sound stopped them cold. A soft sob, muffled and scared. "Mia!" Alex bolted forward, voice cracking. The door splintered under Ethan's shoulder, and there she was, bound and terrified but alive. Alex's arms wrapped around her, both of them trembling, tears streaking dirty cheeks. Ethan's breath left him in a rush, knees almost buckling with relief. But footsteps thundered behind them, Vincent's men, catching up fast. Ethan's jaw tightened, fingers curling around the gun. They couldn't outrun them, not this time, but they didn't have to. Police sirens wailed in the distance, lights flashing red and blue through the shattered windows. Ethan exhaled sharply, a wild sort of hope sparking. The call he'd made during the drive, his last gamble, had worked. Vincent's men hesitated, eyes flicking between Ethan and the approaching sirens, then bolted into the night. Relief and exhaustion crashed over Ethan, knees finally giving out. By the time the police burst in, guns drawn, Ethan was slumped against the wall, watching Alex and Mia cling to each other. Officers swarmed, questions barked, and handcuffs snapping around wrists, but all Ethan could do was breathe. The adrenaline finally seeping out of his veins. In the end, it was over in a blur of flashing lights and shouted orders. Vincent was led out in cuffs, his glare promising revenge. But Ethan just watched silently, too drained to care, as dawn bled over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Ethan leaned heavily against the ambulance, bandages tight around his wrists. Alex and Mia were huddled together, blankets wrapped around their small shoulders. Eyes red but hopeful. "Thank you," Alex whispered, voice hoarse and sincere. Ethan managed a tired smile, ruffling the boy's hair. "Anytime, kid." And as the sun climbed higher, warming the chill in the air, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a strange lightness settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt something almost like peace.